Association returned to the manly ministry of the past. Instead of opening the doors to female ministry, they instead proposed and established courses for parish assistants, a situation open to females. Once again, a second-class position. During the time from the mid-19th century to the first quarter of the 20th century, the women pastors changed the face of what a church should be and how a pastor should operate. They extended this concept to the family homes, then to the local community, and eventually to the state and nation. While they lost some ground during the beginning of the 20th century, they were indeed prophetic. For by 1999, Unitarian Universalism achieved numerical gender equality in the pulpit. Since then, the number of women ministers has outpaced that of the male ministry. And this growth has been experienced by other religious groups as well. For example, the United Church of Christ and Reformed Judaism. While these denominations have seen growth, the numbers of women in pastorate positions is well below 50%. In our Unitarian Universalist organization, we have gone well ahead of the curve. So let's welcome Frank Kowalczyk to lead today's panel discussion.
Good morning. This morning, through the wonders of time travel, we are blessed by the visit of three well-known personages from our illustrious religious heritage. They have come here to discuss their life's work, the struggles they faced in achieving their individual successes, and the legacy they have left us to follow in their sainted footsteps. We have with us Miss Olympia Brown, the first Universalist ordained minister, Dr. Mary Augusta Safford, a pioneer in frontier Unitarianism, and Dr. Carolyn Julia Bartlett Crane, newswoman, suffragist, public health crusader, and pacifist. These renowned women, who did their work in the second half of the 19th and the first quarter of the 20th centuries, have left their marks on education, pastoral care, women's rights, the settlement movement, social services, public health and pacifism, to mention only a few areas in which they were deeply involved. But let us hear their stories from their own lips. Ms. Brown, or may I call you Olympia?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Let us begin with your life.
Well, I was the oldest of 4 children, born in Prairie Ronde, Michigan. In order to give us children a good education, our father Asa built a schoolhouse on our farm and obtained donations from neighbors to hire a teacher. After attending this homegrown school and a town school later, I convinced my father to let me attend Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in Massachusetts. The Calvinist atmosphere there did not appeal to me, and I changed to Antioch College in Ohio.
When did you decide on the ministry?
It was at Antioch that I heard Antoinette Brown lecture. It was the first time I had heard a woman preach, and the sense of victory lifted me up. I felt as though the kingdom of heaven were at hand. That experience turned my direction toward theological study, even though women were not welcome.
In what direction did this aspiration take place?
I applied to the Unitarian School of Meadville, where the trustees thought my application was too great an experiment. Oberlin College would admit me, but would not allow me to participate in public exercises. But when Mr. Ebenezer Fisher, president of the Universalist Divinity School at St. Lawrence University, offered me admission, although he explained that he did not think women were called to the ministry, I accepted.
So, your first step was taken.
Well, not exactly. When I arrived thinking that this would be where I should be, I was told I was not expected. Mr. Fisher assumed I would not come since he had written so discouragingly to me. But nevertheless, I entered divinity school in 1861. I used his discouragement for my encouragement. I completed my studies in 2 years, but still had to convince the faculty to ordain me.
What attitudes did you encounter during your days at divinity school?
The males in my class resented me. They felt that admitting women into the ministry would diminish their roles. I think you call that male chauvinism today. I came away with every feeling outraged and my nervous system permanently shattered. Through the persecutions which I had endured at this institution, inflicted solely because I, a woman, was seeking a chance to do the work in which the Lord had called me.
That was definitely shameful. But you did get ordained finally.
Yes, although I could have had an invitation for a pastorate at church, I preached during the summers. I wanted to be ordained into the denomination. I presented my case to the Northern Association of Universalists in convention, where they ordained me in 1863. Even Dr. Fisher participated in my ordination ceremony. It was a remarkable stand for him and the other men to take on that auspicious day.
Yes, I assume it was in the framework of that time. Now, tell us about your pastoral experiences. Where did they take you?
I began my ministry in Weymouth Landing, Massachusetts. At the same time, I became friends with Susan B. Anthony and began my work in the suffrage movement. Several years later, my congregation allowed me to travel to Kansas to urge passage of the suffrage amendment. During the summer, in a land of unbearable heat and brutal winds, I delivered over 300 speeches, only to be discouraged when only a third of the male population approved the amendment.
But that didn't stop you.
Not at all. I took on a new challenge, the Universalist Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut. This was a church about to close, one with many members but no vision of the future. Furthermore, after my marriage to John Willis and during my maternity leave for my first child, certain people in the congregation conspired to get me removed from the ministry. They were still looking for a good man for that position. I reached a point of despair, and I was considering leaving the ministry.
But did you?
No, it was never my way. I learned that a Universalist church in Racine, Wisconsin, was in need of a minister. It was a church adrift in debt, hopeless and doubtful whether any pastor could again rouse it. It was my type of challenge. And, as you already know, my options in the ministry at that time were severely limited. The prosperous churches were already occupied by men and were looking forward to as the goal of all young men coming into the ministry with whom I, at the first only woman in the denomination, had to compete.
But you were very successful in Racine. That church is now known as the Olympia Brown Unitarian Universalist Church in your honor. What programs did you develop? What changes did you accomplish to bring about congregational reconstruction?
In addition to the normal pastoral duties, I established the church as a center of culture and learning. I invited famous speakers to lecture, not only to the church, but also to the outside community. Speakers such as my friend, Miss Anthony, as well as Julia Ward Howe and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others, came and delivered enlightened lectures on the suffrage movement, women's rights, and similar cultural topics.
But I'm told that when you got that church on its feet, you decided on a career change, and that at age 53.
I don't consider age 53 to be old. But yes, the call to fight for women's rights was just too resonant on my mind. I continued to minister part-time to several congregations, but took my travel bag and went on the road to actively fight for the women's movement.
But as a woman minister, and subject to the unequal pay that women received then for the work they did, how were you able to afford traveling about with your message?
In that respect, I was fortunate to have a loving, supportive husband in John Willis. He had a printing business in Bridgeport when we married. He closed that and went ahead to Racine to find our family a house and to seek employment. He became a partner in the Racine Times-Call newspaper, which tremendously supported my activist lifestyle. He was always supportive of my endeavors.
Much credit to his support of nature. But during the suffragist movement, you had both high and low moments. Was that not true?
Unfortunately, yes. In the last decade of the century, we appeared to reach somewhat of a standstill. There was just no vigor in the movement. But when the Women's Party was formed in 1913, it became my cup of tea. That was truly an energetic group.
Yes, it fit your nature quite well. You participated in large demonstrations, confronted the police, marched in parades, and even publicly burned President Wilson's speeches in front of the White House. And all this in your 80s.
Yes, but I was also one of the few original suffragists to see the amendment pass in 1919. And I was fortunate to vote in my first presidential election when I was 85.
Ms. Brown, you have accomplished much in your long life. In 1963, at the 100th anniversary of your ordination, the Theological School at St. Lawrence University dedicated a plaque that reads in part, "Preacher of Universalism, pioneer and champion of women's citizenship rights, forerunner of the new era. You have truly taken a path less traveled." Now let us turn to the frontier in about the same time frame and talk with our second guest from the Unitarian side of the house, Mary Augusta Safford. Dr. Safford, will you permit me to call you Mary?
Yes.
Thank you, Mary. You were born on a frontier near the Mississippi, isn't that right?
Yes, I was raised on a farm. Sorry.
And how did you get involved with Unitarianism and the ministry?
I was raised on a farm in Hamilton, Illinois. My mother was of staunch Presbyterian stock and was conventional in her thinking. From her Presbyterianism, I received a nagging sense of self-worth. But from her also, I saw that any woman could accomplish on her own. After my father died, my mother managed the farm, kept it solvent, and overcame all our indebtedness. Through all of this, she managed to educate 6 children. On the other hand, my father, a teacher, introduced me to radical ideas about abolition and the theory of evolution and biblical fallibility. After his death, when I was 9, I read his collection of books and journals and obtained a variety of new and different ideas.
At an early age, you developed a close friendship with Eleanor Gordon, a neighbor. Isn't that right?
Yes, she lived on a nearby farm. Because her family held a much greater diversity of religious views than mine did, we spent much of our time comparing a profuse number of religious beliefs and opinions. In our early 20s, we decided to join forces and work together and serve the world as a team.
How did that work out?
Very well indeed. Eleanor and I got our education as teachers. In addition to teaching, I also developed a forum for the sharing of ideas, the Hawthorne Literary Society. One of our frequent speakers gave a lecture on the evolution of religion. It enthused both me and Eleanor to start public worship services, and we formed our first church in Hamilton.
Where did that lead?
Well, Jenkin Lloyd Jones, then the Western Secretary of the American Unitarian Association, recognized vitality in us that he wished to use in his organizing efforts. He asked us to come to Humboldt, Iowa, and assume the leadership of the Christian Unity Church. It turned out the church needed a pastor and the town needed a school principal. We fit in perfectly. I was ordained there in 1880.
What was your ministry like? Your theology, your pastoral approach? And what did Eleanor bring to this work?
Well, as I said, the two of us blended our talents excellently. I preached an ethical-based, humanistic religion free from irrational dogma. I believed in truth for authority, not authority for truth. On the frontier, pastoring was a full-time job. It was just not a sermon every Sunday. Eleanor took the role of a lay preacher. In addition, she started a Sunday school where she taught Darwin and Emerson in addition to the scriptures.
This was truly liberal in your time, wasn't it?
Well, Eleanor and I took on ministry as homemaking for the church family. As teachers, we brought this talent into our ministerial roles. Because of the lack of educational institutions back east, we added adult education during the week. We embraced the kindergarten concept, preschool and early childhood development.
Then your weeks were full. We call that 24/7 today. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yes, we were busy. We formed unity clubs and study groups.
Study groups?
Yes, the people on the frontier lacked education and skills that we brought. We taught cooking, physical fitness, childbearing, and other domestic activities. We studied literature and brought the works of contemporary authors to our congregants and to our local community as well. We brought the church out to the community, a sort of practical Christianity. We discussed architecture to make our houses of worship homier than those cold, imposing Gothic cathedrals back east. Church and home were considered equal. Both should be welcoming and hospitable. They should be utilitarian and simple. When we built a new church, we, the church members that is, decided on the functions we needed before we went to the architects.
Architects? That must have been expensive.
Well, we had to build from the ground up. We had no formula to follow. So we solicited funds where we could, and we worked hard to make the churches self-sufficient. We repaid 80% of the mortgage on our first church in 8 years.
But you didn't stop there.
No. In 1885, Eleanor and I went further west to Sioux City, Iowa. I became the first pastor of the First Unitarian Church, and she became my assistant and later associate minister. We left Marion Murdoch and her sister Amelia as pastor and assistant in our place. We had trained them to carry on the work.
Was this a concept that the female ministry ascribed to? That is, a team pastor and an assistant?
Well, yes, for the most part. Since the church took up all of our time, we found a little time for the domesticity of marriage. Although we taught domestic skills to our congregants, we rarely took care of the cooking and cleaning of our own parsonages. We left that to hired help. Actually, about half of the female ministers we trained or supported followed this concept. There were others that found that the married life to their benefit. Eliza Wilkes married a supportive lawyer who provided both financial support and tender, loving care. Celia Parker and her dentist husband, J.H. Woolley, moved from her pastorate in wealthy Chicago North Side to a black ministry and a life in the Douglas Settlement House on the South Side. Even Caroline Crane, here with us today, will confirm that she used her husband's network in the medical community to open inroads for her successful work in the public health arena. And there were many more such as these. But those, such as Eleanor and I, felt that ordination implied a pledge of undivided loyalty to the church, and the pastor should have the integrity to want to keep her contract inviolate.
What did the male establishment in the East think of these arrangements?
Well, to tell the truth, we didn't much care what they thought. They were averse to women's entry into the seminaries, as Olympia previously told us. If we completed our education, the choices for congregations were very slim. The opportunities that we accepted were what the male ministry would not even consider. Even after we proved our worth as ministers, they still felt the role for a woman in the church was as a pastoral assistant, not a minister. As a result, we sought little or no support from them. Our churches in Iowa and adjacent states were established on local money, local fundraising. Our congregations were housed in new buildings with indebtedness repaid within a few years of completion.
Yes, let me state some facts for you. From 1880 to 1913, no fewer than 20 churches were founded by you and your followers, active and alive ones. In 1890, there were no more than 70 women ordained in Unitarian and Universalist ministries, not all serving as parish ministers. But did you obtain any support from the male ministry?
Well, do not misunderstand me. There were several very supportive persons who worked for inclusion of women into the clergy. Jenkin Lloyd-Jones was our initial mentor, but there were others, such as William Channing Gannett, Oscar Clute, Jabez Sunderland, and Newton Mann, to name a special few.
Well, not all of us are male chauvinists. But your successes were not all in the ministry. After the opening of the 20th century, other factors had a bearing on your service to the needs of the people. Isn't that right?
Yes, I completed my ministry in 1910 after serving in the Des Moines First Unitarian Universalist Church from 1899. I retired to Orlando, Florida, but continued an active ministry with the Unitarian Church there. But I did notice a change in the tenor concerning the ministry during this period. Our preaching and that of Protestantism in general turned to the social gospel, women's rights, suffrage, settlement houses, and pacifism. The increase of churches reduced the average church membership. Male dominance reared its ugly head again. They felt our homey ministry took away from the male machismo. Many of our sisters turned from the ministry proper to devote their time to the public causes that held sway during this time, and they did well in those arenas.
Amen to that. They display what religion truly means in day-to-day activities. Oh, by the way, on that note, while in Florida, you served as the president of the Florida State Equal Suffrage Association. Just several years ago, on October 15th in 2001, the Florida Commission on the Status of Women forwarded your name, along with 9 others, to the governor for inclusion in the Florida Women's Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, only 3 of the candidates of more recent vintage were selected for inclusion. But this nomination indicated your significant contributions to the improvement of women's and of all citizens' life in the state of Florida. Our heartfelt congratulations.
Thank you.
And now let us turn to our final guest, Dr. Carolyn Julia Bartlett Crane. She was one of the disciples of the Iowa Sisterhood, as Dr. Safford's colleagues were called. She was involved in the transition mentioned, that from formal ministry into social action. Dr. Crane, please tell us of your experience.
Please, call me Caroline.
Hi, Carolyn. Caroline, you were born in Hudson, Wisconsin, and even lived in Dr. Safford's town of Hamilton, Illinois. What made you get involved in the ministry?
At an early age, I had rebelled against religious dogma. I heard a lecture by the Unitarian minister, Oster Kloot, that Mary mentioned. His lecture evoked in me a desire to enter the ministry. My father, however, refused my entry into Meadville Seminary, so I went to Carthage College, after which I taught school for 4 years in Iowa.
Was that the point at which you changed your career?
Yes, but not into the ministry. I began a career as a journalist in Minnesota for the Minneapolis Tribune. There I rejected the society page and covered murder trials, Indian uprisings, fires, and political feuds. Since this was the frontier, I even packed a pistol for my protection. I moved to the Oshkosh Daily Times as city editor. When covering a women's suffrage convention, I became exposed to the women's movement and began an association with Susan B. Anthony.
What was the result of that encounter?
I decided at that time to seriously take up the call to the ministry. I assumed the pastorate of the All Souls Unitarian Congregation in Sioux Falls, then a part of the Dakota Territory. After 3 years, the First Unitarian Church of Kalamazoo, Michigan, ordained me as a minister.
Didn't that church go through a radical change under your direction?
Well, yes. We decided in 1892 to make the church a creedless, non-sectarian organization, and 2 years later changed its name to the People's Church. We felt that the church, any church, should house God's people, not be a house of God. Just as Dr. Safford and other of her colleagues created a home-like atmosphere in their churches, we also decided that a church should provide a place to assemble for worship and to deepen the members' spiritual and ethical understanding. In addition, they should become community centers of hospitality, educate children and adults alike, and provide workshops to make life better for all.
And how did you accomplish this?
From outward appearances, our building looked like any other Romanesque church. Our sanctuary could seat over 700 for worship on Sunday and for lectures on weeknights. The basement had workshops for teaching office skills, sewing, psychology, metalwork, carpentry, and drafting. Our kitchen and dining room offered free classes on home economics, cooking, and nutrition. The students served hot lunches to local factory workers. We even had a kindergarten so that parents could take advantage of our offerings, including a gymnasium.
Today we call that daycare and provide such services for different reasons. But after all this success, your life took another turn, didn't it?
Yes, in 1896, I married Dr. Augustus Crane, and through his colleagues and in the medical profession, my focus turned to the greater community and into the public health field.
How did this come about?
In preparation for a lecture on meat preparation, I was visiting slaughterhouses in Kalamazoo, where I came upon the most appalling unsanitary conditions, and I found this to be common among all other cities I visited. As a result, I lobbied successfully for a bill for inspection and regulation of these facilities in Michigan and developed a model ordinance for Kalamazoo. Having taken courses in urban support systems in Chicago, I pushed for improvements in street cleaning, water supply protection, food processing, and school sanitation. The street cleaning methods were adapted from successful ones used in New York City. On this issue alone, which resulted in savings of 40%, the City Fathers ignored my attempts for municipal improvement, but eventually they came around.
During this time, didn't you miss the pulpit?
Well, not really. I was so busy with my new career, which took me to survey the public health systems of over 60 cities in 14 states. And as Dr. Safford has stated, the focus of much of the female ministers became social action rather than preaching.
Yes, Dr. Safford did mention items such as settlement houses, pacifism, and women's rights. Where did your involvement take you then?
Well, during 1914 and the war, I went over to Belgium to reconstruct many of their cities. I attended the peace conference at The Hague, recruited women for wartime occupations, and worked on emergency food processing and distribution.
But after the war, how did you fare?
To tell you the truth, I was crushed. Information came out about war profiteering and graft. I sensed that evil corrupted, even though people had the best of intentions. And with peace achieved in Europe, I had a moral dilemma about maintaining our preparedness for war. I worked with others to explore the causes and cure of war. For this effort, I was branded a disloyal American, where just a few years earlier, Henry Ford had requested I join his team of 100 representative Americans. What a drastic turnaround.
A sad turn of events, indeed. But you retained an active lifestyle when you returned to Michigan, isn't that right?
Yes. Although officially retired, I did remain active in the local affairs of Kalamazoo. It was not in me to give up entirely.
Yes, I must state the obvious for our audience. None of you gave up when you boldly went where others were fearful of even trying. We are truly honored by the paths each of you and many of your contemporaries have taken, the struggles you have overcome, the visions you have enunciated, and the accomplishments you have achieved. You are truly sainted women and have left us a brilliant legacy with which to carry forward. Would any of you like to add any concluding comments? Olympia.
Yes. Dear friends, stand by your faith. Work for it and sacrifice for it. There is nothing in all the world so important to you as to be loyal to this faith, which has placed before you the loftiest ideal, which has comforted you in sorrow, strengthened you for the noble duty, and made the world beautiful for you. We three are sure you will continue in our footsteps. You see, I believe that the right and just will prevail, unfortunately, just not overnight.
Amen to that. And let us thank you for sharing in this service with us. Thank you, and let us all thank these fine individuals.